Okay, I think it's time. So, hi everybody. Thank you so much for joining my session. Today we are going to be talking about approaching developer relations in an open source community. My name is Shedrak Akintayo. I'm a developer advocate. So let's get started. So about me, just a summary of my experience. I'm a developer advocate at the Cloud Foundry Foundation, where we are working together with the Cloud Foundry community to provide the best developer experience on Kubernetes. I'm also a technical writer at LogRocket and Smashy Magazine, and I'm also an Auth0 ambassador. And on the other hand, I am an open source community Africa core team member. So we try to get a more open source enthusiasts contributing to open source here in Africa. So I'm based in Lagos, Nigeria. Nice to meet everyone, and I hope we enjoy the session. So without further ado, let's just get started. Now, this entire talk is based off my article on how we approach developer relations at the Cloud Foundry Foundation, which is an open source community. If you want to easily check out the application, the article, I left a link in the slides, and I will be sharing my slides after this talk. So first things first, what is developer relations? I mean, we need to understand what developer relations is before we can really do anything about it. So as a lot of people actually have conflicted definitions for developer relations. And one thing I'll always say is developer relations isn't just for corporate companies. Developer relations is for every community of developers. Anywhere developers are coming together, developer relations can apply to that particular community. So developer relations is not just for corporate companies, big tech companies. It's for every type of community where developers assemble. So it don't necessarily have to be for a product. It could be for a open source software. So this is what my entire talk is based on today. Now, what is developer relations? I mean, the whole topic of this session is based on developer relations. So what's the developer relations? We need to understand what developer relations is before we can really do anything about it. I'm a very big fan of Mary. So Mary Tevangal, she's a very active developer relations expert in the community. And she said that developer relations is a group of developer advocates, technical community managers, technical ambassadors, documentation writers, trainers, and more who all exist to empower you, developers, to do your best work. So I totally agree with what she said. This is like one of the best definitions I've seen for what developer relations really is, because it basically specifies that developer advocates are not just the only ones in developer relations. We have more people: technical ambassadors, technical community managers, technical writers, documentation writers, even trainers. Basically, all we are doing is working hard as we can to make sure that we empower developers to do their best work. So that is what developer relations is. So what is developer relations to open source software communities? So, I mean, this is our main focus for today. We are basically talking about how we can relate the intersection of developer relations and open source communities, how to approach this particular subject matters when it comes to open source communities. So in my definition, in my words, it is basically caring about developers. Very, very important. The care, the empathy is very, very important. Educating developers, growing a community of developers, and collecting feedback from the community. As developer relations experts, as a developer relations program, you should always have an avenue for collecting feedback. It's very, very important. Now, developer relations can come in any form. Like I said, community management is also part of developer relations. Documentation writing is also part of developer relations. So there's the term developer relations is a large body. It's a large role encompassing various other roles. So one thing we need to understand that it's not just having to do with just writing code or etc. It could be managing the community, making sure that the community thrives, making sure that everybody is in harmony in the community is also developer relations, because the open source community is majorly developers at heart, developers, designers, technical writers, etc. in open source communities. So it's always really important to understand these things. Now, why should open source software communities care about developer relations? So why should they care? It's if you are telling me developer relations is really important today, why me we as the open source community, why should we care about developer relations going forward? I mean, we as the moderators of these open source communities, we as the community managers of these various open source communities, why should we care about developer relations moving forward? Now, developers, for what we know, developers are at the core of every open source software communities. I mean, if it has to do with software, every open source development community, developers are at the heart of it. So we need to acknowledge these facts and make sure that we create a sense of empathy towards these developers. So now, when you have a well-built out developer relations program, it is basically suggesting to your developers that, okay, we see you, we hear you, and we are trying our best to make sure that we empower you to do your best work. So it basically boils down to creating a sense of empathy towards developers. Empathy is really, really important in every part of life, not just in physical interactions. Every part of life, empathy is really, really important. So also in a community, empathy towards one another, empathy between the moderators, between the managers of that community and the community members themselves is also really, really important. Now, the next thing is, why should you care? It empowers developers to be able to utilize the software properly. I mean, in the sense that if you have a well-built-out developer relations program, I mean, you are focusing on making sure that developers that are using this particular open source software they are basically enjoying the best form of care that they can get. For example, writing great documentation, which I would still go and I will still talk about going forward. Writing great documentation is also one way of caring, allowing developers utilize the software properly. Another way is jumping on live streams to people to talk about XYZ and how to use XYZ on this particular software. So it's basically empowers developers to be able to utilize the software properly. The next thing is it enables collaboration internally and between other communities. This is really, really one major important part of encouraging and embracing developer relations. It allows that collaboration between everybody internally in the ecosystem and between other communities. I mean, if you have a representative from your community going to source partnership or collaboration with some other open source community members to see, okay, how can we make this people using, for example, if you want to use for an open source project like Vue.js and an open source project like maybe for maybe an open source database project. I mean, how can you connect your Vue.js application to maybe a front end to a some open source database project? So this collaboration basically shows that, okay, you care about developers, you care about the various use cases that your developers, people that are using your community members are using your project, the technology generally. So going to source out collaborations, it basically enables your community generally to do these collaborations seamlessly. Now, how do we pay more attention to developer relations as an OSS community? Like, okay, now I own an OSS community, I'm part of an OSS community, I'm a member of an OSS community. So how do I pay more attention to developer relations generally? I'm also a community manager. How should I pay attention to developer relations generally? Now, first things first is you cannot start a developer relations program. You cannot focus on developer relations if you don't listen to your community. You need to take your time to listen to your community. Community is the heart of whatever you are doing. So you have to take your time and derive feedback from your community. This is very, very important. Listen to the community, hear where they are having issues, what you think you could do better or generally going forward. So listening to the community is also one very important. Listening to the community is one very important thing to do when it comes to paying more attention. Now, the next thing is understand what you are trying to achieve. I mean, okay, there are various parts to developer relations, right? Understand that, okay, as a community, what are we doing? What do we want to do what do we want to get from our developer relations program? What do we want to get from? So it could be establishing collaborations between other communities. Sure, you need to understand that that's what you want to do. It could be revamping existing documentation to make it better. It could be anything. So you just need to understand that, okay, from this developer relations program that we are trying to focus on, we're trying to get, right? What are we trying to achieve in the long run? What are we trying to get from it in the long run? Now, the next thing, which is also something I always encourage everybody to do, every community, is to learn from other communities getting developer relations right. You need to be able to emulate these other people that are getting, other communities that are getting XYZ or developer relations right, for you to be able to say, okay, this works for them, let us try it. Developer relations is all about experimenting to see what exactly works for your community. So if you keep iterating over various methods, over various strategies, and say, okay, we found, okay, this works for us, this does not work for this other community. So you have to keep learning and growing, on learning and growing as a community, and also learning from the other communities that are getting developer relations right. I've highlighted some communities. The Vue.js community, they are doing a great job when it comes to getting doing developer relations. They have a fantastic documentation. They have various conferences that they're doing to make sure that they keep educating their developers. They keep making sure that the developers are getting the support they need going forward. Now, the React.js community also does the same. The Gatsby community, which is not entirely open source, but most of their Gatsby is also open source. But even though they are a company, they are still like an open source community, right? So the Gatsby community is doing well, organizing conferences, making sure that they are educating their developers consistently and as much as they can. One very important one is the Drupal community. Of course, organizing these events is also one way of saying, okay, we are trying to hear from what our developers, what our people in our community are doing, and we want to showcase it to other people. We want to showcase it to each other and say, okay, we are seeing what you are doing and we want to give you the opportunity to showcase it to every single person and also teach each other. So the Drupal community is doing a very, very great job when it comes to getting developer relations right. And hats up to the entire community, Drupal community. Everybody is doing what they should do right, and it's awesome to see that. Now, the next thing is to develop a strategy. Okay, since we've listened to the community, we've understood what we are trying to achieve. We are trying to learn from other communities. The next thing that is really, really important to do is to develop a strategy. Now, in the next slide, I'll be talking about what strategies you could use to enhance your developer relations program. Now, how to build an effective developer relations program in an open source community. Now, this you can, as an open source community, you can pick out various methods, whatever methods it could be. You could pick out a single method out of this. So you don't necessarily have to emulate every single thing I've highlighted, but it's just necessarily to iterate over these things, as developer relations is mainly about experimenting. So first, you need to understand the demographic of your community. So do you have more developers? Do you have more designers? Do you have more technical writers in your community? You need to understand this to know how you can cater for every single part of your community. Now, the next thing is to provide feedback avenues for folks in your community, which still boils back to listening to your community. So you need to provide avenues to see, okay, how are we doing well as an open source community? We, the moderators, what can you recommend for us to do better? It's one way of also creating an effective developer relations program. Now, another thing is make your community inclusive and accessible. Of course, it's really, really important to have diversity, to make sure that your community is properly diversified. If you're having you're having talks, make sure that the speaker lineup is also inclusive and diversified and also very accessible. The next thing is to community reward programs. I mean, you could have various ambassador programs. So this is like rewarding people that are highlighting them, people that are doing great job in your community and highlighting their works, and also putting them out at the forefront of your community, basically. So this community reward program is also one way. Now, great documentation for the technology, which is very, very important. Creating a great documentation for the technology is also important. No matter, I know everybody's busy when it comes to open source. I mean, there are a lot of people that are actually full-time open source developers or contributors, etc. So I know it can be difficult, but doing the very best to have a great documentation for your technology, make sure that developers actually utilize this your software properly. Now, collaboration with other communities, which is something I've been saying over and over, it's very, very important to see how you can collaborate well, because it creates a sense of togetherness. I mean, it's a software development field. We should be able to collaborate with each other seamlessly. Now, more tutorials and more use cases. Now, having like tiny bits of tutorials and more use cases is also very important. Organizing talks and webinar is also one way you can structure your developer program. For example, inviting top contributors in your community to come on, just like the DrupalCon. come on and talk about what they are doing with the technology and see how well other people can learn from it. So this is majorly what I suggest you should think about when you're trying to build the effective developer relations program. Now, that is like all for the talk currently. If you need more information, you can check out the article that I specified at the beginning of my slides. I will also be sharing my slides. Thank you so much for listening to my talk. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to talk to the Drupal community. If you need to follow me on Twitter, at Coda_BLVCK. If you need to send me an email for collaborations, etc., last name, first name at gmail.com. So my last name, my first name at gmail.com. So yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for joining. If there's any question, let me know. So thank you so much.
Shadrach, can you repost that link? I don't think it made it to the beginning of the chat there.
Okay, sure. So I just shared it to the chat. So
all right,
if you need to check it out, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for joining.
Yeah, thank you everybody. Bye. Okay, I think I just saw a question. What tips can you share to a large organization that isn't typically a tech company trying to increase developer relations and engage the OS community? I think generally you need to sit down with your team and understand, okay, what are you trying to achieve generally from connecting with the OS community? So you need to sit down with your team and understand this, and also next thing you would probably want to do is, get more experienced developer advocates to come on board and help you define the strategy that would work for your company, because strategy that works for company A would not work for company B. So you need to sit down and actually understand what you're trying to achieve, then get people on board that could actually help you do that. So that's basically how to do it. You don't necessarily have to be a tech company. Yeah, you don't necessarily have to be a tech company. Yes, the slides will be available. The slides will definitely be available. Hold on, let me see if I can get that. I would definitely upload the slides link to everybody. I'll do that. Any more questions? Okay. I currently see the Q&A tab. Okay. So Chad said, "Hey Shadrach, fantastic talk. What would you recommend for setting up feedback channels to community? Best tools for that?" The best tool for a feedback channel is to have a Slack community. I'm always a big fan of Slack. So having a Slack community, having a Slack workspace for your community is one of the best ways to have feedback channels. So Slack, currently Discord. So if Slack doesn't work for you, you could try out Discord. So these two tools are very, very easy for you to get started with and also get feedback from your communities. One other way is also, of course, create a feedback Google form and maybe post it on the Slack group you've created and say, okay, if there's any way you think as open source moderators, you think that we could do better, then you can also share it. Now, so Rabi said, how do you make sure people who come to the community stay in the community? Wow, this is a big question. So the best way to do this is to make sure that you are giving everybody a voice in the community. When everybody feels that there is a sense of togetherness in the community, then anybody can say, respectfully give an opinion or have an opinion, then people would feel much more comfortable that they're being heard. So one way is to make sure that everybody has a voice in the community and everybody can easily give opinion and see feedback happen almost immediately. So that's one way to make sure that people who come to the community stay in the community. Thank you, Christian, for pointing me to the Create tab. Okay. Thank you so much for asking me questions. So any more questions? Okay, then, since there are no more questions, okay, there's one more question. Any advice specifically for the Drupal community for the next big improvement? So what is DR? Okay, developer relations. Okay. So one community I'm always very, very excited about is Drupal community, because Drupal community seems to be getting it very, very right when it comes to developer relations. I mean, I have a friend in the Drupal community, Sarah Lawson, and Sarah is just really, really good when it comes to engaging with the community. So currently, I do not necessarily have any advice, because I feel like the Drupal community is doing it right. But going forward, I feel like to engage more developers, I think reducing the pricing for conferences, the DrupalCon, is one way of making sure that everybody, making it more accessible to your developers. So not everybody necessarily have a lot of money to spend on conferences or have conferences budget. So reducing the pricing for, I know it's an open source community for sure, but doing this is sort of one way of making the community more accessible for everybody, not necessarily people that have conferences, budgets, etc. So that's just something specifically I have noticed, and I feel like I should share. It's always really a good idea to make your community event as accessible as possible. Maybe having, yes, exactly, that's one way of doing it. Maybe having more companies with money sponsor, yes, exactly. So reaching out to these companies for scholarships is one way of doing it. That's sort of the way we do it in Africa. Actually, we have a way of reaching out to top people that are respectable developers in the community and saying, okay, do you want to sponsor like 10 people to the community, to the conference, and see how many of them respond. And really good number of them usually respond and sponsor a bunch of people to buy tickets for them to various conferences. So that's one other way of doing it.